condition, not the average. So right here, if you look on an average line, well, there's nothing extreme going on here. I mean, everything was within average, except for we had a record cold spell and a record hot spell during individual years. And so extremes determine the forest distribution, the forest growth, insects and diseases, all of those types of things. And they're often not seen in the data set, so you got to be careful about averages. Likewise, when you say TDO is on a 30-year cycle, well, in the last 100 years it was on a 30-year cycle. Now you go back another 300 years, I've looked pretty hard. I don't see a 30-year cycle on there. I see a very random back and forth on there. And you know, this is complicated stuff. It's not one thing that determines climate out there. So when we look at the last 1,000 years of climate, this is the average from different data sets. These are the outliers or the error that's in there. So this is the mini ice age, the medieval optimum when the Vikings colonized Greenland. This is when they died out of Greenland, and this is where we are now. Now there's a point behind all of this. And the point is that climate precipitation determines what our forests grow like, what species occur where, and what burns when. And if that's the driving factor behind all of that, that driving factor is highly variable. So is climate change occurring? Well, absolutely it's occurring. It always has occurred. It's a natural phenomenon that occurs out there. The question of what influence humans are having on it, that's a whole different question. Even if humans weren't influencing it, climate changes. And the point here is that we had this medieval optimum that lasted a couple hundred years. Then we had the mini ice age that lasted about 400 years. And gee, are we going into another medieval optimum? Now this is very important because when we go into a forest and we're restoring a forest to that grove of 500-year-old ponderosa pine trees, we want to protect those and we want to restore it to keep those alive, which is a great thing. But when were those trees selected for? The middle of the mini ice age. So we had a genetic selection for trees that grow well in a cool, wet climate. Are those the best seed trees to leave out there? Okay? I'm not saying it is or it isn't. It's just something to think about because we have to be very careful. Are we selecting trees that are adapted for a warmer, drier climate or a cooler, wetter climate? And if we look at the big picture, okay, the last 10,000 years, this is a logarithmic scale, so 10,000, 2,000, 1,000, 300. We can see that here's where we are now, here's where we're projected to go, even without human influences. Take that out of the picture. You know, we've been much warmer before, for longer periods of time. Now, as a forest ecologist and a manager, these are important questions to me because, quite frankly, I'm interested, but I'm not an expert in anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. But I want to know, I have a forest that I'm managing out there. What's the future condition going to be like? Is it going to be hotter and drier, or is it going to be cooler and wetter? And for how long? And what should I do as a forest manager to try and keep my forest alive? And so the point behind here is it can get warmer and drier, and it can stay warmer and drier for a long period of time. On the other hand, it can get cooler and wetter, and it can stay that way. So we need to figure out which way is it going. Now there's other things that are in there. Solar cycles. Okay, we're on a 13-year solar cycle, and 2013 we're due for the next big one. Okay, so the sun plays an influence in all of this. And each of those cycles is on trajectories. And we were on a general warming overall trajectory, so every cycle was getting warmer and warmer. The last I read is we're now on a cooling cycle, and that's why some people are predicting a new ice age. So the bottom line is we don't know for certain which way the climate is going to go, just from natural phenomenon. Okay, back to forests, and how does this play a role? Well, Paul Hesburgh, same research, he looked at a wetter forest type. This is the grand fir forest type. So in 1930, grand fir is the blue, Douglas fir is the gray, ponderosa pine is the green, and this mustard colored is grass or forblands. Okay, pretty complex picture in 1930s. Here we are in 1990s. It is now dominated by Douglas fir and grand fir, the shade-tolerant species that during, and they need more moisture, that during this wet period from 1940 to 1980 had a great time and dominated the forest. So forests that used to be very diverse had a matrix of different ages, species, structures, have through this wet period gotten to be very uniform in the way they look. And you get into these stands, they are in this late successional stage, which means we have a multi-state canopy, a lot of woody debris on the ground, a complex, or what might be called an old-growth forest ecosystem. So what role does that play? Well, the way forests grow is you start with a fire or a glacier retreat, you start with bare ground, and a pioneer species occupies the site, colonizes because it has adaptations to grow on hot, dry surfaces. Ponderosa pine is the key species that does that. Lodgepole pine, western larch. Okay, these are your pioneer species. And they then create a shaded environment where surface temperatures are cooler, and then the shade-tolerant species like Douglas fir or grand fir or cedar can move in and occupy that site. And the role that fire can play, if it's a frequent fire, spurred on by a hot, dry climatic phase, where on the average summer it's dry enough to burn, we have these frequent surface fires that exclude Douglas fir, grand fir, or cedar out of the site and can, for long periods of time, maintain these old growth several species, larch, ponderosa pine, etc. Okay? But once it gets to this phase right here, our fuel complex is so big that now, quite naturally, we have a stand replacing fire regime. This defines the mixed severity forest type. If your forest stand is in this condition, under the right climatic periods, the average summer, it's going to be a surface fire. If your stand has progressed to anywhere here where you have this complex fuel, it's a stand replacing fire. This is the mixed severity type, the majority of the northern Rockies. Now out here you might have the brush phase, manzanita or whatever you have growing out there, and oaks, etc. Now, the other part of all this game is water balance. The trees grow on the water that's in the soil, that's absorbed through rainfall or snowfall. And as you go on this phase, what you build is leaf area. And water balance is determined by the amount of leaf area you have. The more leaf area you have, the more wicks you have in the soil, the more water is getting sucked out of the soil faster. And so your overall water balance goes down, down, down. So here you have a leaf area index of about 3. That means 3 feet of total leaf area per projected square foot of soil. Here you might have 8 square feet of leaf area per projected square foot of soil. So the water is being utilized at double the rate. But worse, it gets even worse than that, because these hang up snow and rain, and it evaporates right back. So if you say you're in a 30-inch precipitation zone here that rains, right here with this canopy, about 25 inches is making to the soil and can get absorbed by the soil. Here, only half of it is getting there. Most of it hangs up in the canopy and evaporates back. So instead of 25 inches, you're getting 12.5 inches of recharge, plus this huge leaf area. So what do you think is going to happen to this forest? It's hugely water stressed because of these basic processes that are at work out there. And when it's water stressed, what loves stressed trees? What loves stressed people? Colds, pests, pathogens, things like that. So if we're going into a warming phase, or we're in this advanced successional stage, trees are more drought stressed and more susceptible to bug attack. Winters are more mild and insect survival increases. In the northern Rockies, we need 40 below to kill mountain pine beetle larvae. If it's not 40 below, they survive. Okay? 2 beetle produce 80 offspring. If half are male and female, they mate. 40 pairs produce each 80 offsprings. So second cycle, we're up to 3,200. Third cycle, we're up to 160,000. Fourth cycle, we're up into 1 million offspring from 2 beetles. So they can blow up pretty big if there's no mortality on them. Longer summer favors more insect reproduction. They do better, hotter, drier. You might notice that with yellow jackets, hot, dry summers, lots of yellow jackets. Cool, wet summers, very few. Increased wildfire activity that injures more trees. Again, more host trees. You build epidemic populations, and the problem with epidemics is that normal background bark beetle kill is not necessarily a bad thing. They're weeding out the less genetically adapted trees. They're improving your tree quality. But when you have an epidemic population and you have 1 billion beetles, even the healthy trees get killed. And so that genetic selection ceases to occur. And of course, and the other thing also is climate. How does that play a role into it? Well, people who have done correlations show that in warm Pacific decadal oscillation phases, which is, the shaded area, not only do we have more fire, that's the blue line, our mountain pine beetle also tends to outbreak during that period. Okay, so there is a correlation between bark beetle attack and drought stress. Trees drought stress, it can't produce pitch, defense mechanism, it can't push it, the trees start to die. And this is what we have in Montana right now. Because of all of those things culminating together, we have the perfect storm conditions for mountain pine beetle, for spruce budworm, for Doug fir beetle. And so this is right now our areas with 40% or more mountain pine beetle killed across Montana. Pretty significant. And mountain pine beetle likes lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. The lodgepole pine is in the high elevation areas. So look at this area. This is the Big Belt Mountains here. Lodgepole pine, high elevation. Get a little underneath to the drier Doug fir. It's mainly Doug fir. Spruce budworm loves Doug fir, so watch that Big Belt area. That's spruce budworm, major defoliation. So all told, with the combination of fire and insects, of our 25 million acres, more than 50% has been significantly impacted in the last 10 years. That is amazing. That is a major ecological change. Now, this is a false number because this is done through aerial survey. So if half your trees are red one year, it's counted. If they're red the next year, it's counted again. So this is probably closer to 5 or half of that, 5 or 6 million acres. But still, you put them together, that's more than 10 million acres of forest that is seeing major changes, massive mortality out there in the last 10 years. Okay, that is an ecological phenomenon. It might be natural, but it's still an ecological phenomenon. So the future. Well, weather predicting has gotten better. This was last fall's prediction for the winter. It was actually pretty well on. What's burning right now? What's dried out? Okay, I was amazed when I saw this. I said, "Yeah, right." But they were on. Same way with temperature. They were pretty good. So weather predicting is getting better. But when we look at our stands, and this is a typical mid-elevation forest that most private landowners in Montana have. So you got these 300-year-old ponderosa pines surrounded by anywhere from 10-year-old to 200-year-old Douglas fir. How do you treat this? What do you do with it? How do you prepare for the future? If your objective is fire hazard reduction and forest restoration, what are you going to do? What are you told to do? Whack the Doug fir, leave the ponderosa pine, right? Now, remember, these ponderosa pine were selected for in the last mini ice age. Okay? The ponderosa pine can persist for another 100, 200 years. I mean, there's up to 700-year-old ponderosa pines. They're rare, but they do exist. 500 years is more common. But physiologically, they're not very strong. They're pretty weak. So restoration would mean restore the ponderosa pine savanna to frequent fire. Okay? Is that the best thing to do? Well, restore means in general, restoration is seen as a symmetric with degradation. An undisturbed forest in a natural or historical condition can be degraded, and a degraded forest can be restored to that natural or historical condition, which was a frequent fire ponderosa pine type, right? Of a certain process, certain climatic period that led to a certain time. On the other hand, conserve means to keep some quantity constant, to neither create or destroy, to keep it functioning, to keep it there. We have 25 million acres of forest. To restore would actually mean to bring it to less than that 25 million acres that was there 200 years ago. To conserve means to keep it right now as forested area, but to manipulate it in such a way to keep it alive and keep it functioning. So conservation The management of a renewable natural resource with the objective of sustaining its productivity in perpetuity while providing for human use compatible with sustainability of the resource. Okay? The point is, what do we do to conserve a forest? And hence my title. Is conservation, are our forestry practices for conservation, are they sustainable? Is it going to meet our objective of keeping it forest? Or is it going to convert to something else? Now in Montana, we're in the position where a huge part of our forest, and I would speculate up to 30% of it, may convert to grass and brush field. Now that's neither good nor bad. If you're in need of elk winter habitat, that's a good thing. If you want a watershed, you want forest there, you want timber productivity, it's a bad thing. So I'm not placing a value on it. I just say, you know, if our objective is to keep these forests as forests, we might be severely challenged here in the future, because what we've seen happen the last 10 years is quite significant. Okay, so what you've all been waiting for, what about Europe? This is outside of Salzburg, Austria, looking into Bavaria to the north here. This is internationally ranked one of the top 10 destination spots for tourists around the world. Okay, so recreational quality and value here is extremely high. These forests are 100% managed. Okay, now what does that mean? Let's go, well, I already said that. Let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Okay, here's Germany, former East Germany. Forest owners, 46% private, 20% community. Cities, municipalities own those forests. 30% state. There is no federal land. Federal forest, a little bit, military reservations, but no federal forest service. All the forests are managed by the states. Forest type is 40% hardwoods, maple, beech, oak, 58% conifers, and then a little smattering of other stuff in there. Inventory is 702 billion board feet right now. Okay. So here is a schematic of Germany and the areas that are forested. Now, for historic perspective, it is presumed, based on research and best guess, that about 98% of Germany was forested. But you can't really say prior to human settlement, because if you talk prior to humans, you're going beyond the last ice age. Europe has been occupied by humans, Homo sapiens, and before that Neanderthals, for the last at least 100,000 years, spanning several ice ages. Okay, so it's pretty hard to say, okay, what was there before human activity? The other thing to remember about Germany is there is no German people, so to say. There are different Germanic tribes that were as diverse as the North American Native Americans. And they didn't always like each other very much. Okay? They were in warfare a lot of times. And when Napoleon rolled across Europe in 1799, Germany consisted of over 1,000 individual, independent, separate kingdoms. And he united them into states. Basically said, unite yourselves or else I will execute all of you. Okay? And so it created these major German states, which was dominated by Prussia, the military might of the time, which was also important in eliminating Napoleon. But Bavaria, to this day in Germany, has special status as a free state. They're still their own country within the Union of Germany. They have their own flag, their own national anthem. They consider themselves Germans, of course, but they also consider themselves Bavarians. And they traditionally hated the Prussians. There's an old joke. You know, the Prussians are the militaristic ones, the very orderly, straight, disciplined. The Bavarians are much more relaxed people, known for temper, known for drinking lots of beer. So, you know, the old trains in Germany were compartments, 2 bench seats, sliding door, the bench seats facing each other. And there's an old story there about, to define this, that on one bench is a middle-aged lady with her 20-year-old daughter, both quite attractive young lady, or ladies, I should say. And across from them is a Prussian wearing his coat, sitting there very straight, very proper. And next to him is sprawled in the seat, kind of half asleep, working off a hangover, is the Bavarian. And they go through a tunnel, and you hear 2 sounds. You hear a kiss and an owl. And they come out of the tunnel, and they're all sitting there again. And the older lady is sitting there going, well, I can be proud of my daughter. I raised her right. One of those lumps over there tried to sneak a kiss in the tunnel, and she smacked him one. I'm very happy. The daughter is sitting there going, I don't understand this older generation. One of these handsome men tries to give her a kiss, and she smacks the poor guy. The Prussian is sitting there, his cheek just burning, going, oh, isn't this typical again? The Bavarian kisses one of these ladies, and I get hit for it. The Bavarian is slouching there, smiling to himself, going, gee, I hope I go through another tunnel so I can make that kissing noise and smack that Prussian. Okay, so, you know, there is some differences there. There are. All right, so forest types. Traditionally, the maple beech forest, this is what dominated the German forest, traditionally. Okay, it's thought to be. Beech is the shade-tolerant climax species. Fire didn't play a big role in these forests. And so these are the forests that the Romans encountered with the Germanic tribes living in them. Now, the most common forest type now is what we call Norway spruce, Picea abies. And this is also the spruce that people talk about, the plantation style of forestry in Germany. Spruce is a marvelous species for wood production. It's a very nice, high-quality white wood. You can make anything of it. It's shade-tolerant, so it regenerates underneath itself. It's very productive. It grows very well. It's self-pruning. I mean, you can't ask for better wood if you own a sawmill or if you're a landowner and you want to make money. And its native habitat, actually, is higher elevation or wetter sites. And when I was up in the Bavarian forest and I looked at this, I said, by golly, you know, you could spin me around, open my eyes, and I'm in a subalpine fir habitat in Montana, high elevation. It's a huckleberry understory, spruce overstory. That's its native habitat. Now, there's also, particularly in the drier, sandier soils, Scotch pine, Pinus sylvestris, planted a lot. The foresters don't like it. It has poor form. The wood quality is not particularly great. It's kind of what we call bull pine, fast-growing ponderosa pine. It is fire-prone, and it does burn as well on these drier, sandier sites. So those are the dominant forest types you're going to see. This more in the Berlin flat, sandy areas. The spruce more in the productive forest areas, with a smattering of hardwoods in between. And this is kind of a mixture. This is the spruce. This is the beech forest. This is 7% of the forest is oak. 13% is called the this is the high value hardwoods. They call it the gem hardwoods right there, where they make high value products of curly maple, things like that. A few species out there. Now, interesting enough, the #1 planted species in Germany right now is Douglas fir. And this is the West Coast Douglas fir, not the inland Douglas fir out there. And I'll talk about that a little bit yet. Now, the other parts of Germany, there are, amazingly for that amount of people, vast areas that look very rural. The Germans have worked very hard to keep their landscape productive and rural. This is the Black Forest of Germany. This is a southwestern part of Germany. Let me go back here. So, but what you also see is the people are clustered, and you can't get away from people in Germany. You walk 5 miles, you will walk through 3 or 4 distinct, unique little towns. And they passed a law in the late 70s that said you may not build your house out on farm or forest land unless you own more than 100 acres. Then you can tweak the law a little bit, maybe it would be justifiable. But for smaller parcels, you're not allowed to do that because that would ruin the productivity of the landscape. So to get zoning to build a house requires about 10 years. So these towns get bigger very, very slowly. Land use planning is very, very important. It is a socialist state too, remember that. Okay, so they have a little different way of governance. Now, to talk about Germany and all land management, you have to talk a little bit about the history and the culture, because forestry and land management is, after all, a social decision-making process, how you're going to use that land. So we have to go back to the Germanic tribes that were at war with each other. And this is what the Germanic barbarian looked like at about 400 AD. Okay, this is what the, well actually, let's say right at 0, okay, birth of Christ, this is what he looked like. And right at about 5 AD, Germany was invaded by Roman legions, expansion of the Romans. And this is what the Romans came with. Now, the Germanic tribesmen were like American Indians. They were undisciplined. They were not terribly organized. They lived in their own little clans in the forest, and they practiced kind of a silvopastoralism. They harvested from the forest, they grazed cows, they grazed sheep, but their forests were an integral part, and they were Druids. They worshipped trees, beech trees and linden trees were part of their spiritual basis. The Romans brought with them land surveying, agriculture, and unified armies. Now, when they invaded Germany, they met with considerable resistance. These barbarian hordes, when the Roman organized legions would attack, would disappear in the forest. And so when the legions would march through, they'd get sniped at by arrows and spears at a very nook and cranny, but they were never to be seen or found. So Julius Caesar took his most trusted general and said, I want you to conquer and destroy the Germanic barbarians, or the barbarians in this land called the Teutons and all the other names for them. And his general's name was Germanicus, hence the name Germany. And Germanicus took his 3 legions, and this was actually, they had one legion that went into this area and disappeared. It was never seen from again. They were massacred by the Germanic tribes. And the German leader in charge of that, his Germanized name is Hermann. And there's a big statue to Hermann on the Rhine with a sword because the Germanic tribes beat back the Roman legions. So Germanicus came into Germany with 3 legions and made a big march through here and burned and pillaged and massacred wherever he could find them, and came back out and had achieved absolutely nothing because nothing was safe anymore. And so he declared this country as uninhabitable because of the barbarians, and they created, like a Great Wall of China, it's called the Line of Lime. It was a series of Roman fortresses along here to keep the Germanic barbarians from making raids into the civilized parts of the Roman Empire. Okay? So the point here is that the Germans, the Germanic people, tribes, have a very deep and personal connection with their forests. They're part of their cultural history, they're part of their cultural value, it's their sagas. So forests have a very deep meaning to them. All right, and just as a little bit of a side, the Roman Empire started to crumble 500 AD. By 800 AD they were gone, and the whole European area degraded into a kind of a feudal order of different kingdoms fighting each other. These knights that we often talk about didn't really appear until about 1300. One suit of armor cost the equivalent of an entire lifetime's of wages for a normal worker. So metallurgy developed during this time, but these guys weren't around very long, only a couple hundred years before cannons made them obsolete, as well as the English longbow. And so as a result of the evolution of European culture, German culture, you had these castles form, and you had every town was a fortress unto itself with a wall around it. And the agricultural land was around that because that was the most important thing for food. And so they could retreat behind their walls in case they were being raided. And then the forest was further out, a very important part of wood, fuel energy, and building material that was further out. And just like every farmer had his parcel of land, they had their parcel of forest out there as well. And so you can go into these some of these old villages that haven't been destroyed, and the woodwork and everything on here is over 500 years old. I mean, things were built to last. Wood was very important, and of course it took a lot of energy to make a beam out of a log with those old wooden tools. So wood was very highly valued, as were forests, because wood was a major form of energy. So, I mean, World War II, after World War II, everybody was in the woods gathering twigs and branches, anything they could burn to stay warm or to cook on. Now, because of the burgeoning human population and the over-exploitation of forests, certain nobility in Germany, in central Germany, Thuringia, commissioned an experienced academic, and that time academics were associated with the churches, to write the first texts about silviculture. Heinrich Kotte was one of them. He wrote his first texts in the late 1700s about forestry and sustainable forest management. And I threw a few quotes out here because when I was there, I read through some of those texts, and it was remarkable, some of the things that he observed 300 years ago. And at this point in time, forests have been manipulated for at least 1,000 years already, since the Romans came in and they needed a lot of wood. And most parts of Germany had been deforested at one time or another. So basically, his appraisal was that the successful practice of forestry is half science and half artistry, and only the experience gained from doing makes a master. Now I put this up here because this is still the case today, as far as you cannot learn forestry in a classroom. You can learn the principles of it, but you learn forestry by doing and learning from your mistakes and observing and learning from apprenticing to someone who knows what they're doing. So it's a very important part of forestry. Also, he said there are 3 reasons why the practice of forestry will always be at a disadvantage. 1, the long time it takes for a forest to mature. Okay, annual crops we see a return on. You plant trees, well, you're going to wait a while before you see a return. You may lose interest, you may lose your land, someone else gets it. So, this is a disadvantage for forestry. It's pretty hard to make Congress understand that if I plant a tree now, I won't receive an income from that for 80 years, so don't tax me right now for it. 2, the great variability in site quality and character in which forests grow. Okay, we all know or have learned that centralized decision-making on forests, a rule of forest management that encompasses a vast region, is the SUV of forestry. You know the definition of an SUV. It does everything equally poorly. Okay? So forestry, particularly in the mountains, is site-specific. In Montana, I can walk 100 yards and I can walk through 3 distinct forest ecological zones. And if I apply the same forest management principles across all 3 of those, I'm going to be screwing up on 2 of those sites. So, still very valid today. And the third one is the reality that those who practice their art, forestry, to perfection find little time to write, versus the theoretician who practices little finds much time to write. Okay, we do. I'm in the academic world. Believe me, I work out in the field. And the last person I want to have write a forest management plan on my property is a forestry professor at the university. I mean, you have expertise in fire and soils and the theoretical part of how it works. And my analogy for that is, what is the most complicated thing that we have built? Arguably, I'd say the space shuttle. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. And it took several thousand engineers to figure out all the different components. But if you ask one of those engineers to fly it, do you think they can fly that thing? No, it requires a pilot. The pilot can't take apart the computer and fix the circuits or the chips on there. But they understand how the whole thing functions that allows them to fly it. And they are experts. A forester is like a pilot of a piece of land. Okay? They understand the principles. They know what makes it bank left and right. But if someone asks them, okay, what organism is that down in the soil that I just picked out here and looking under the microscope? I don't know. That's what you need a soil microbiologist for. But don't ask a soil microbiologist to write a forest management plan. Okay? So we have to societally come to terms with what role do the experts play and what role do the practitioners play in all of this thing. And interestingly enough, this was written 300 years ago. So, things haven't changed that much. All right. Now, also, because the reason for the need of forestry, I mean, if nobody was living here, would you need foresters? Not really. Nature kind of works it out. And if the forest disappears, who cares? Okay, that's part of nature's processes. Glacial cycles, it's all happened before. The real problem is we have a lot of people that have demands on the forest. So really, forestry is a social decision-making process. So Heinrich Kutta was also a little bit of a philosopher. He said, okay, well, if we're going to manage our forests, we also have to deal with increasing human population. And what do we do with this increasing human population? Now, mind you, this is 1799. So put yourself in that mind frame. Whoop, sorry, going the wrong way. So number 1, well, you can live for yourself, let things happen, don't worry about others' well-being. Well, that certainly fits to a certain part of the population today. 2, you can send the excess somewhere else. Well, they did. The Germans sent them to the United States. Okay, a large part of the U.S. has a very strong German background in there. Okay, number 3, you can thump on the head and bury them. No, that's not very popular. Okay, they tried that too, and it really got them in a lot of hot water. And 4, you can work towards finding options that they can live without starving or becoming a burden to the state. Now, considering this was written 300 years ago, with the social setting, the educational capacity, I think Heinrich Kutta was a pretty bright man. And, you know, this still plays an important role in the philosophy of how forests are managed in Germany. All right, so here we have Germany, the forested areas. Of their 25.5 million acres of forest, the 11.2 million acres primary use and designation is as a nature park. 4.9 million acres is for biodiversity protection. Only 220,000 acres is wilderness, and the biggest one is right here, the Bavarian National Forest, and I'll talk about that specifically. Now, mind you, they're harvesting 12 billion board feet per year off of this, with a primary designation as nature reserve or nature park. So, now part of this is the primary Munich watershed. It's a karst region. Munich is a city of over 5 million people. They are supplied out of this two primary watersheds. About 70% of the water comes from this area right here. It's a karst formation south of Munich that is all forested, and it's managed specifically for a 2-canopy forest structure, an overstory and an understory, because they don't ever want to be without any kind of forest cover, because they are deathly afraid of erosion and a degradation of water quality. Now, mind you, the water for Munich is not treated or filtered at all. It is pure water that comes out of these karst formations, is piped into Munich. The other part of it comes from Berchtesgaden out of the Alps. It's piped to Munich and stored in massive underground stone caverns. It is never filtered. It is never treated. It comes out of the tap there just as pure as it comes out of these rock formations for 5 million people. So mind you, water quality is immensely important. And you pay for water in Germany. You pay per cubic meter of what you use. And I'll show you a graph of that later. So they want a 2-story canopy on here on all of the primary forest watershed, which means they cannot let this forest go to an old growth climax phase where you only have 1 canopy on the overstory. They have to continually harvest it so that they have enough light for understory regeneration. So to maintain their water quality, forest management is essential. I thought pretty remarkable, because the New York water supply comes out of the Catskills. Is there any forest management allowed on it? None. It is verboten. You know, you can maybe hike in it, but you got to be very careful. This is one of their shafts that goes down, and when you look down into it, this is the water pooling in this, and then it goes into a feeder, and they have about 20 of these. And this is the water that supplies Munich, their primary watershed. Now, if they have to build a water treatment plant that can handle the water volume for 5 million people, can you imagine how much that's going to cost? So, just a little aside. Now, this is 2005 numbers. They're a little behind in their data gathering, and this is what I put together when I was there in 2008, so I'm a little behind in my data gathering. But give you an idea, their annual harvest in 2005 was 11.8 billion. The year before, was 15 billion. They import 21.58 billion board feet as round logs, mainly from Russia, but also from France, because France has lost its wood processing infrastructure. So they buy their logs, and when I was there, I traveled to France, to the border, and looked at all these forests, and I asked a French forester, well, what do you do with the logs? Because he said, we have no mills. He said, well, we send it, he kind of smiled and said, we send it to the Germans, they mill it into wood, and then they sell it back to us for 5 times the price. Yes?
Why don't the French have any mills?
Honestly, I can't answer that. I kind of asked that question too. And kind of the answer I got was, again, with a little bit of a chuckle, and he said, well, we enjoy life too much. So, you know, it takes a lot of energy and effort. And, you know, France has a lot of natural resources. They can make a good living off their natural resources. Germany's only natural resources is wood. and their workforce. They import everybody else's junk, do value added, and sell it back to them. They have no natural resources to support them. So their labor is the only thing they have. And quite frankly, I think the main reason is that the Germans are forced to do it more efficiently and cost effective than their neighboring countries are willing to do it. So, and that means, yeah, we enjoy life too much because while the dumb Germans are sitting there working a 12-hour day, we're, having a party and drinking a glass of wine. So, annual export is 24.2 billion board feet. In 2005, 208 million board feet of high-value spruce was shipped and exported to the United States. Now, that upset me a little bit because we're rich in natural resources, and to be importing wood product from Germany with 83 million people just seems fundamentally wrong. Okay, their annual use is pretty high, 20.54 billion board feet. So where's the difference made up? You'll find if you go to Germany that the Germans recycle and reuse everything. When you put your garbage, you sort it into different bags, it goes to different places. Almost all their paper gets recycled, a lot of their wood gets recycled, and they build things truly to last. Now how do they do that? Well, first I'll give you an overview of the state forest systems. This is state forest land. State forests in 2005, they had a major reform of forestry there. Originally, state forest land, the state foresters were paid by the state government, the Bavarian government, off of tax income and also revenue. The purpose of the state forest land is, of course, to make money, but also this is nature protection. It's very important. It's one of those caveats under which they manage this. This must remain forest, period. Each area, just like the Forest Service, is broken into districts. These are individual districts within one central forestry location in Bavaria. Each of these districts is about between 2,000 to 5,000 acres in size. It is managed by one forester. It is a lifelong position. You finish their forestry degree. Their system is a little different. When they finish high school, depending on their grades, they have a massive high school exam. Based on their grades, they get to study different things. Free of charge, but they have to have the grades. To study forestry, you have to be an A- average on your final exams. Okay, you get a C, there's no way you can become a forester. Okay, to be a doctor, you have to have an A. That's where the gradient is. When they go to college, they don't take general ed classes. It's immediately concentrated topic-specific area. And under their current system right now, 3 years masters, 5 years, 3 years bachelor's, 5 years masters, the average forester comes out, has 5 years of concentrated forestry education, pure forestry and associated sciences. The bachelor's degree, average bachelor's degree graduate in the United States has 2 years of forestry education. A master's, then you start to specialize, maybe 4 years. Okay? Then, after that 5 years, you're not going anywhere with a bachelor's, by the way. You need a master's. Then you apprentice with a forester for 2 to 3 years. And then if you're good enough, maybe 10% of those who apprentice apply for a job and they're on probation for 5 years in that they get a district. And if they pass it, then they have that job, and that is their lifelong job, which means they become integrated with the community. And remember, these communities, Germans are walking people. On the weekends, they're out walking out here. They're out there. They have local use, farmers. Half of their logging workforce are farmers who do it part-time. The other half are contractors, logging contractors. Okay? So when this community here is out hiking here and they see something they don't like, you know who they go and talk to? The forester. And if he doesn't address it, guess what happens? You're out of there. Okay? So the integration between the forestry professionals and the communities is very tight. It's necessary because the community is the workforce, and they're the ones that have the immediate benefits and also, what's the opposite of benefits? Downfalls, pitfalls when something happens to this forest. And this is surrounded by private land, and we'll get into that in a second here. So, and the point is that a forester, and I agree completely, this is one of the things I think we need to learn here. These foresters are intimately familiar with their land. And their forests can be very diverse. You can walk across, each of these is a management unit, by the way. Okay? Well, no, I'll show you a close-up of this. I'll do that right next. So let's look at, for example, this unit here, Bishop's Green. Approximately 3,000 acres. that's the different stands they have. Average stand size is about 15 acres, management unit, and on that 15 acres, they may have 3 or 4 different treatments going on. They may have one. So when you look at a German forest, it is highly complex. It is many different units. Now, I asked them when I was there, how much of your forested stand, or of your overall forested stand, what's the age class distribution? I mean, what percentage of it is little stuff, what percentage of it is old growth, big stuff? And they didn't quite get my question, what I was asking, because it is such an obvious answer to them. So, well, it's a completely even distribution. Because the number one objective is consistent and constant wood supply every year. And so they work with their wood processing facilities very closely to make sure that the wood processing facilities have the wood supply they need. And you know what that does for the wood mills? It means they don't have to spend all their time fighting for wood supply, and they can be looking into technological advances of improving their mills and their product. So I work with a lot of mills in Montana, and they spend at least 40% of their time trying to find wood for the mill and fighting battles about getting that wood. Which means they don't have the time to put into their mill and their product to make it a better product. And that's why, perhaps, to answer your question, why the French may not have the wood processing mills. Because the only thing that makes the German economy function is staying cutting edge in what you produce. Cars, shavers, whatever it is, they make a conscious effort. And their forests, what comes off of this is every year a predictable supply of wood. But it's not contrary to the forestry practice in Germany that's often thought of these days. It's not one big massive plantation of spruce. It was. In the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, Germany produced more wood per acre than any nation in the world because spruce is great for producing wood. And nothing else was there except for spruce. There's no understory, no nothing, and each tree was very carefully cultivated. They are moving very strongly away from that. And they want as diverse and complex a forest ecosystem as they can get. And so when you look at a forest, there it is. And I like to hike. I like wilderness areas. I like to hunt. I like to chase elk around in the mountains. And when I'm in a forest that for 10,000 acres has been converted to a frequent fire severity ponderosa pine savanna, one, I don't see anything, and two, I'm bored stiff because it's all the same. When I walk through a German forest, every corner has something different. It's very interesting. And as a result, the wildlife in Germany is out of control. It's their biggest problem are the roe deer that are eating everything out there. Now, they don't have large carnivores because with 83 million people and bears, it just doesn't quite mesh too well. Now, when I was there was a bear, a brown bear. The European brown bear is like a cross between a black bear and a grizzly. Okay, they look like a grizzly. They're a little milder, but they can be pretty ornery too. And one crossed from northern Italy into southern Bavaria, got into someone's bees and into their sheep and killed a bunch, and then went across the border into Austria again. Then he came back again, and the foresters were ready for him. They shot him, killed him. Oh my God, the outrage, the newspapers, and they named him Bruno. Poor Bruno. He just wanted to live. And there was a huge uproar, hoopla for a month, and then he was stuffed and put in the Munich museum and done. Now, it's not done. They have Greenpeace originated in Germany, by the way. So they have very strong, extreme, maybe Greenpeace isn't that, but they do have their very extreme environmentalists that sit in trees and say, no, you can't cut this tree and all of that. They have everything we have. But to date, the social license to practice forestry is still there. And they're trying to improve it. And the thing that I really like when I work with the faculty there, and we have good faculty here too. I don't mean to slam our faculty at all. But their faculty is focused on finding solutions. Okay, if a bear is living in here, how do we manage this forest so the bear can live in there and we can maintain our wood supply? That's their emphasis. And in my experience in academia, one of the problems has been is, if I discover the reason the sky is going to fall, I'm going to get the most funding. And therefore, I'm more interested in finding problems because then I attract more funding than finding a solution. It's a very big difference. And the other interesting thing amongst their faculty there is every year they have what's called a curatorium. The faculty present their research, and every practitioner can come and listen in. And I sat in on one, and believe me, they're not kind. So if I'm trying to figure out why the red-backed bull has 3 hairs on the end of his tail instead of 5, they're going to ask you, why are you wasting my taxpayer dollars to do that? And I better have a darn good reason for explaining that. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but I have to understand how it fits into the context of things as well. So, a lot of things going on. So, as you tour through the German forest, what you see is a lot of stands of different ages. Now, this is the old system. This is primarily spruce, what you see there. Now, a few other things, what they do. Roads are very essential. There are roads everywhere. They are only drivable by forestry practice, loggers and foresters. Every piece of land in Germany is available for public access. As a private citizen, I can walk anywhere. Can't do damage, but I can walk anywhere. So they have these roads everywhere, and every 60 to 100 meters, they have a permanent skid trail. And they have the permanent skid trails designed in a curved fashion, so when you walk down the forest, you can't look down them. And the purpose for that is to keep the mystery in the forest. They have specific classes of how to make a forest stand interesting. So when you're doing this silviculturally, you're not just looking at the volume that's there, you're also looking at how can I manipulate this so this is interesting for people that are hiking down here. So recreation is integrated into the forest management plan. And by golly, it works well because hiking in these forests, for someone who likes wilderness and chasing elk and bear and all that kind of stuff around, I found their forests very, very interesting to walk through. I wasn't bored. They also follow a plan of trying to never have a land that is unproductive for trees. This is forest. Now there's understory vegetation, that's important. But they will do about 4 or 5 thinnings before the last big tree is out there, and in that process is regeneration. So basically they view a clear cut. Clear cutting is not acceptable socially. And in state forests it's against the law to put in a clear cut. Now, you can put in group selections, but not a clear cut. And I asked them what that is defined as, and they said, well, you'll know when you see it, type of thing. So there is no, you can't say there is no clear cut over 1 acre in size allowed. But in general, clear cutting is not allowed for 2 reasons. One is considered unproductive. When you clear cut, you have about 20 years of the regeneration phase where you're not fully utilizing that space for tree growth. I mean, there's other stuff growing there. So their objective is to have 20-foot trees before they remove the last big tree, and thereby they effectively reduce the rotation age on that acre or that hectare by 20 years. And that's how part of how they get this high productivity off their forest. I would say in the Northern Rockies we're opportunistic loggers. We're not really forest managers. Oh, there's a group of trees, let's take that. And then we'll try and regenerate it. But we're not really in forest where we had planned to do the harvest. You know, we have lots of reforested areas, but it's not any long-term planning scheme. Here, what you have here was planned from its inception. And how it's harvested is planned from its inception, with the ability to modify that because each of these stands, remember this area is being managed by one chief forester. He may have people, or she, a lot of lady foresters, may have people working for them, technicians. But the decision of what and when and how it happens is made by that forester. And you know how much computer modeling they use? Okay. I just led a study tour over there in this May for 2 weeks. And we were in a stand just like this, and they ask you, well, you know, what have you modeled for the productivity, or is this part of your plan or scheduling? And the forester, or how did you decide when to harvest this? The forester said, well, I was walking through it, and I thought, yeah, it's about time to harvest this. Okay. Now, they do have it written longhand, they do have their plan, but what they do is determined on an annual basis by the condition of the forest stand, which gives the foresters remarkable ability to deal with things as they happen. Not because, okay, 10 years ago we said we're going to thin this now, and therefore we're going to thin it, by God, by high water or whatever. Within that matrix, they have areas they set aside. This is a 500-year-old oak tree in a 40-hectare patch that was designated 500 years ago to remain natural. And so integrated into their forest matrix are not vast wilderness areas, though there's pressure to do that. As part of their matrix and patchwork, they have patches that say, we're not going to leave that alone and just let it go, called natural areas. It's integrated into this, and it's actually part of the Natura 2000 agreement for the entire European Union. is to protect unique areas and habitats. But it's part of the plan. And should this tree die, most likely they'll let it fall over and do its thing. But under certain circumstances, they may be allowed to go in there and harvest it. Okay? So it's not set in stone that you shall never go in here and not use a chainsaw. But it is preferred that you do not, because the objective here is to keep this natural. Now, every tree species has been mapped out for height growth and age. So this is how tall they get based on their age, every different species. So they have, they do use models in a qualitative sense, that they know what tree species is going to do what. So this is, this purple one is cherry, birch, and alder. It matures or maximizes the height growth early. So this one, they might actually plan on harvesting it at age 30 within their matrix of trees. In others, in general, their spruce harvest is, their target is 120 years. And by 120 years, these spruce are big in a lot of places. So they do use, they do know what every species does. They do a practice called Z-tree selection. When the trees are already 2 meters tall, there's a lot of genetic variation, there's a lot of site variability. Is this one taller than this one because it's genetically superior or because it happens to be growing on a nutrient hotspot? Well, they don't care. They'll pick out those trees and they'll give them a little extra space. And they try to do 10 per hectare, so 3 or 4 per acre. And these trees are slated to become their high dollar trees. These are their peelers, their veneer trees. And they select them already at a very young age. Because these are my super performers, so I want to give them a little bit extra because they're going to make me the most. The rest can stay thicker. And that has increased their quality of their yield by 10%. Income. 10% return, pretty good these days. They do use modern harvesting techniques. This is cut-to-length harvesting in a spruce forest. They do use a lot of other types of equipment. Some of the modern equipment development, a lot of it occurs in Germany and Scandinavia. I saw a cable logging system there that required 3 people. But the logger at the bottom controlled the cable except for the last 10 yards, which the guy at the landing controlled, and he also had a boom and he stacked them. So it was remarkable that with 3 people, they were producing an enormous amount of volume with a cable system off a mountainside. Their goal is that 50% of their forest work is done by local residents, farmers, who in the winter have off time, and they prefer to do logging in the winter, particularly in hardwoods because they don't want to ding up the sensitive bark of these trees. The other 50% is done with modern contractors, the cut-to-length equipment, etc. And that way the community remains involved with what they're doing. When you walk through the forest, you see log decks everywhere, and this is the average size. Little log decks everywhere. And so it doesn't create a lot of disturbance. On the weekend, a couple thousand people might walk by these log decks. Logging, forestry, recreation are very highly integrated. Everybody sees it, they know what's going on. It doesn't sit there very long. They have it, here's the tops, here's the high value logs, here's the lower value logs. They call it strong wood and weak wood. This is saw, this is going to go into boards or beams. This may go to paper. This is bioenergy. Another bioenergy stack. Now, Bavaria is, well, let's see. Do I have those stats on here? This is Bavaria, Germany. Okay. These are the different wood product mills. Now, how big is this? This is probably, Bavaria is as big as 3 or 4 Western Oregon counties, okay, schematically. These are all the wood processing mills that are there. This is softwood mills that will produce, what's 400 times 50,000? 2 million board feet per year processing or greater. These are broadleaf sawmills. These are small family-owned sawmills. This is paper mills. This is wood chemical processing plants. These are biomass energy generation plants. So these things right here. Primarily heat for centralized heating systems for communities. Steam heat, pipework. Secondary process is electricity, though they do have pure electricity power plants. And then pellet mills, right here. So, on average, you don't have to haul more than 20 miles in any direction to have a very competitive market for your wood as a landowner. Bavaria itself has 6.25 million acres of forest, over 700,000 forest landowners, 15,000 miles of forest roads, which can only be accessed by vehicles if they're forestry related. These are walking trails, bicycling trails for everybody. Everybody has access to these. Annual harvest in this, imagine a 4-county area in western Montana producing 3.1 billion board feet per year. Yeah. This is average size of the sawmills. The majority of the sawmills are family-owned, small volume. These are cubic meters. Everything is done in cubic meters in Europe and the rest of the world. The bigger sawmills, here we're talking again at 2 million board feet or more a year, is right here. And they have about 4 big sawmills that process over 80 million board feet a year in Bavaria alone. A lot of small ones. Costs, okay, these are gas prices, euros per gallon. Okay, euro right now is about $1.5. This is electricity, cents per kilowatt hour. So 14 euro cents is about 20 cents American. So they're paying 20 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. The size of the circle is the cost for water per cubic meter. Okay, in Germany, you pay 1.42 euros per cubic meter of water. Okay, these are the other countries. This is Switzerland, Austria, Italian, here's Russia. So Germany has the highest costs, processing costs, of any European nation. Yet they are able to keep this infrastructure in place. So you can see the tremendous pressure they're under to be the best at what they do. Otherwise, they have no economy. What they build tends to be 4x4 beams and stone construction. Wood is highly valued and it's built to last. I gave a lecture or a presentation to a forest landowners group in Bavaria in a facility like this. Here, where am I here? I'll show you in a second. I'll finish that story. This is average landowner size, acreage size. You know, we talk about small forest landowners here. Color coding again. Once you start to get into green, you're 2 hectares or bigger. 2 hectares, that's 5 acres. The average private forest ownership size in Bavaria is 5 acres. This is 1/10 of a hectare. So that means 0.247 acres. You can be a forest landowner with 2/10 of an acre. Okay? The majority of the property owners own 5 acres or less. There's very few that own 10 acres or more. So, you know, we talk about fragmentation. How do I manage all these little parcels of land? Well, again, they got 700,000 landowners owning the private land in a 4-county area size of western Oregon. So what they have done, wrong way. Oop. And just give you an idea, this is close to where I live. This is a forested parcel for an ag landowner. It's about 5 acres in size. Now, interesting enough, when you go into that 5 acres, you will find about 7 different stand characteristics in that 5 acres. Okay, so you go in on one side, you can see here's the spruce plantation. Here's an older patch of spruce. There's a couple big old beech trees they left just for animals and pleasure. On the average forest looks like this. You notice the stumps are very, very low. Wood is very valuable. There's a market for everything. The flares are sawed off of the logs and sold for bioenergy. For a while, they're even pulling out stumps. Now, the other remarkable statistic is you also see these piles of split logs all over the place in Germany. And that is because in Bavaria, 1/3 of the population still uses wood as a primary heat source. And that is in fireplaces and ovens, stoves. It's not any kind of modern, well, it's very advanced by our standards because these old stoves are highly energy efficient. They have a roaring fire for about 2 hours, and a huge heat sink, and that heat sink heats the house for the rest of the day. None of these smoldering things. By law, to burn wood, the wood has to be dried for a minimum of 2 years. Every 3 months, your chimney has to be inspected by a chimney sweep. So a colleague of mine, or person that I hired to work for me and do certain things, is German. I didn't hire him because he's German. He was just good at what I wanted him for. He came up with what's called the TOM principle: technology, operator, maintenance. Okay, their stoves are top of the line for efficiency. The operator has to know what they're doing. No dampering down and dry distillation producing a big plume of smoke. If someone sees a plume of smoke coming out of your chimney, they'll probably call somebody. You get a fine. And maintenance, you got to keep it working well. So, remarkably, in a country with 83 million people, 1/3 of the population heats with wood. Now, in Missoula, you're not allowed to burn wood because of air quality. So, that's some issues there. So, overall, if I had to sum up, and our state forester, when I came back, said, well, how would you, in a few words as possible, sum up why German forestry works? What makes it, what's the underlying principles, what makes it work? And I've tried to do that. So, number one, forests and their use by communities have become highly integrated. And there are multiple good things about that. One is if you have buy-in, you're likely to support it. Secondly, you're likely to like what you see out there because you're part of the process. But also importantly, if the community is out there, they keep touch with what's out there. If you exclude them from it, then they don't realize what you're doing. So for us, having our property open to anybody who wants to walk through it is kind of doesn't sit well. It doesn't sit well with me. I don't want all of my neighbors walking across my 20 acres. So, gosh, if I have to go to the bathroom, I can't anymore, But the flip side of that is that these folks, the community sees what's going on out there. They're in touch with it. And remember, land management is a social license. 2, a predictable wood supply was and is the primary objective of forest landowners and overall forest management. Because if you have a predictable wood supply, someone can invest in high technology and advance to become the most efficient and the best at what they do because they know this is going to be coming down the pike and for the next 20 years I can pay off my expense. If I don't have a predictable wood supply, how on earth can I invest $20 million in a new mill? Forest managers are long-term and respected members of the community. Okay? They're in an area, they're part of the community. If they screw up, they're going to do everything they can to make it right. And screw-ups are allowed. Okay? That's part of learning. Now, special aside, I talked about windstorms. The biggest wilderness area in Germany is the Bavarian National Park. It's this ridge between the Czech Republic and Bavaria. It's about 200,000 acres that was set aside as Old Growth Spruce Forest so forests can do what forests naturally do. It was set aside in the early 1980s. It was set aside in the 1980s. By 1990, spruce bark beetle, Ips typographus, started to work away. Ips typographus is as bad as mountain pine beetle in Montana, except mountain pine beetle has 1 generation per year. That means 80 offspring every year, right, per pair of beetles. Ips typographus has 3 generations per summer. Okay, so here it takes in Montana, it takes 3 years for 2 beetles to produce 500,000 offspring. In Bavaria, in the spruce, it takes 1 summer. So bark beetle outbreaks can grow very, very quickly. So in the 1990s, spruce bark beetle outbreak started in the Bavarian National Park, and now 80% of that 200,000 wilderness area looks like this. Okay, is dead. And part of the problem is, of course, beetles don't know property lines, and they're going onto private property. They're flying out. And so a lot of political downfall from that. And so actually they've gotten permission in this wilderness area to start trying to regulate the beetle production by harvesting the brood trees. By the way, if you're a private landowner in Bavaria or a state forester and you have spruce beetle in your trees, you must remove those trees within 3 months. If you do not, the state will come and do it and charge you for it. Okay? And that's how they prevent bark beetle outbreaks. My original thesis was to compare bark beetle outbreak frequency between Montana and Germany. I had to throw that out the window because they don't have bark beetle outbreaks, except for in the Bavarian National Park. Because as soon as a couple trees are hit by bark beetles, they're gone. They're sent to the mill. And likewise, the reason they don't like windthrow, because those trees lying on the ground are perfect habitat for spruce bark beetle. So, in a windthrow area, you must treat and remove those trees within 3 months, or else the state will come and do it and charge you for it. A little different than our philosophy in there. The other thing is that remarkable is they're having this massive salvage harvesting operation. This is a recreational trail that gets about 2,000 visitors a weekend. That's the logging decks. You know, we tend to keep people away from our forestry operations for a variety of reasons because we're a liability crazy country. Everybody is seeing what's going on. And there's little signs posted of why they're doing it. So public education is really, really, really important part of German forestry practice. Yes, sir.
What's the rainfall?
It varies. It goes anywhere from about 20 inches annual precipitation in northwestern Bavaria to about 40 inches of precipitation in the high spruce zones. And I'll address it a little bit more in just a second, and I'm going to wrap it up and try and go a little faster. All right, so I just wanted to show you. I mean, have a picnic. Okay, did you ever see this here? Now, I mentioned this park natural areas on the Czech border. This is Bavaria. This is Czech Republic. While I was there, there was an international meeting between the Austrian chief foresters, the Czech chief foresters, and the Bavarian chief foresters, and I was invited along to offer an opinion to my Bavarian counterparts. They were curious of my response to all this. It was very interesting. The Bavarians are trying to manage this bark beetle outbreak because it's not staying within the confines of the park. And you know, the mission of the park isn't quite meeting its expectations of having old growth spruce trees anymore either. So the Czechs, on the other hand, are doing nothing about it. They're just letting it go. So the Bavarian purpose of coming to that meeting was to pressure the Czechs to start doing something about the bark beetle outbreak that's flying over the border. As far as I could tell, the Czech purpose of coming to the meeting was to tell the Bavarians to buzz off. And the Austrians were just kind of standing back and letting it happen. So, you know, international politics at its finest. They asked me what my opinion was. I said, well, what are you replanting? They said, we're planting spruce back. I said, why on earth are you planting spruce back? If this were Montana, I'd be planting larch out on these areas to try and diversify the species. They said, we would love to. We're prohibited by law because this is a park, and if the larch was here naturally, we would plant larch. Because there is no larch here naturally, we can't plant larch here. So they also have their laws that they have to contend with. A few other things. Global warming is very important. We argue about biomass and carbon sequestration. They already have it in their law books. The official Bavarian carbon emissions reduction strategy. Maintain productively growing forests. Increase growing stock of wood in the forest for carbon sequestration. Store carbon in the form of wood products. Accepted in law. Use wood as an energy source instead of fossil fuels. Use wood as a primary building material instead of aluminum, steel, concrete, and plastics. This is part written into Bavarian law already. Current wood energy use in Bavaria replaces an equivalent of 396 million gallons of heating oil per year right now under this overall plan. So for certification and carbon credits, they're all poised to already reap a second benefit in the European carbon credit market, which now may be as flat as ours, because they've already accounted for all of it, and it's already part of their overall planning process. Now, I'll just skip that. Now, water issue. What they've done, their academic community, remember I mentioned that their really primary emphasis is to find solutions for problems. Problem, global warming. Global warming may result in higher temperature, which means lower humidities, which means higher water demand. Greater evaporation off the trees, which means you need to manage for soil water balance. Okay, this is the soil water balance underneath areas supporting spruce, where spruce water use is known. The objective is to keep spruce through silvicultural manipulation supplied with water year-round so it photosynthesizes and grows, rather than going into drought, shutting down photosynthesis, and not growing halfway through the summer. So this is all the spruce forest based on its water availability. So wettest areas, highest productivity. As you get to green, it's potential percentage-wise of millimeters per every 100 days of water deficit. And northwestern Germany, a region known as the Spessart, is a very dry area. It's in a rain shadow. So this is current condition. Don't plant spruce up here because it's going to be water stressed most of the time. And if it's water stressed, it's susceptible to bark beetles. And actually, in 2001, they had a massive bark beetle outbreak right here that killed all the spruce, so you don't have to manage for spruce there anymore. So they do occasionally get them, but it's very rare. And if the average summer temperature increases by 1 degree centigrade, which reduces relative humidity, which increases water suction out of the trees, what's the water balance going to do? That. And if it increases by 2 degrees centigrade, it's going to do that. So every landowner, and you can dial in down to a 10 square meter resolution on this. So if I own land here, for every tree species, I can dial in on a website and figure out what my water deficit would be per tree species, and potentially what spacing I need to manage for so that that tree species has adequate water to grow. It's a pretty phenomenal technology for a group of landowners that is very technophobic with regard to computers. So they don't like computers any more than the rest of us. The other thing they're trying to do, and this is now gets into their controversy, is they have all of this spruce, and this is the development of spruce stocking of volume in Bavaria from 1970 to 2002. You can see that they've increased their spruce volume by 1/3, overall wood volume on the land by 1/3 in the last 40 years. What they're trying to do now is to reduce the spruce and bring in more beech, because beech is more drought resistant. And also, it's bark beetle resistant. And so, where the historic German forest management model was plant the species in a silvicultural manipulation that maximizes wood volume, because we need wood volume. Now remember, Germany is a poor country. Okay? When Hitler came to power, 60% unemployment. And before that, Ed, you gave me a paper from back in the early 1900s you sent me. The loggers were making, here they were making 25 cents a day, there they were making 10 cents a day. Okay? These people were dirt poor. And the only thing they had, it was what they could grow, and they needed to grow wood because otherwise they couldn't heat their house. So maximizing volume has always been a major incentive, and they did it very well by planting spruce prolifically because it's such a great grower and producer. And even the bark beetles kill it, you can still burn it for energy. Well, now what they're trying to do is they're worried about climate change, increasing temperature, less water, spruce becomes more susceptible to bark beetle. They want more beech planted out there. And they want more management at a micro scale, smaller and smaller parcels out there, so that they have a very diverse landscape for biodiversity, for wildlife, but also, what do you do when the economy is getting very uncertain? You diversify your portfolio. They're managing the forest the same way. They don't know what their economy is going to do, i.e. climate, so they're trying to diversify their forest more and more and more. Clear cutting is not viewed very well. Group selection is a highly used tool there. They are worried about fire. They have had fires there, particularly in the pine forests. 8 firefighters got killed in 1975 in this stuff. Okay. So, an example. This is planted beech inside a spruce forest. And you can see the scale at what they're doing it at. Small scale, very diverse. This is part of the solution. They have climate stations. This is across Bavaria. These are climate stations that constantly monitor soil water availability, precip, temperature, evaporative demand. So, again, we end right there our tour of Germany with the Alps, highly recreationalized, and you can see what the management philosophy is, what they're trying. Now, I beg your indulgence here. 2 hours is a long time to listen to me. I'm going to just throw in a few things. Now we'll get back to Montana. What bearing does that have? What can we do? Well, Montana naturally, mixed severity fire regime, if you were to define Montana's forest, it was a diverse mosaic of tree age classes and species because of the mixed severity fire regime. Okay? Here's lodgepole pine, created from a big fire. This is Doug fir patch that was spared the fire and hence still persists. That spruce budworm has defoliated now for 6 years and is killing it. But the thing is, if you have different species, if one gets hammered, the other one is still there. This is the point. A few other examples. The closest entity to managing forests in Montana in a long-term sustainability with their objective is diverse species, diverse age classes, mimicking mixed severity fire, are the Indian tribes. This is the Flathead Reservation, and what you see here is western larch. Western larch will only regenerate on burned areas or heavily scarified. This is in the fall. So the western larch patches you see here are the result of past fires that were there and then fire size. My house is right here. This is the Schley fire. And I look at that and I say, hey, that's pretty close to mimicking what the past fires did based on the larch, except for the Schley fire, to keep it that small, cost $10 million of firefighting equipment. Okay? So, but you see all the little patch cuts, clear cuts they're putting in here. They're trying to bring in mosaic back on the landscape. Salish Kootenai, Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes. Federal managers tried to do that. This is the Lola National Forest. You can see these past clear cuts also in the fall. The only place where you're getting your several larch species is in those clear cuts. This is what the old growth is looking like. It is, mortality is unbelievable in there. The fuel loading is unbelievable in there. A few other quick things in there. Let's move on. Species diversity is important, okay? Spruce budworm, ponderosa pine didn't get hit. Now when we look at the current mountain pine beetle outbreak, this is a landscape in the East Garnets. These are sections, 640 acres. So we see a big block. This pink is 40% or greater mountain pine beetle mortality. Lodgepole pine. Big block. What does it look like? Okay. Do you see much diversity there? Even textured. All lodgepole pine, all same age. So obviously this is like having a city with nobody younger than 80 years of age. It's not a sustainable population. And the problem is, when it dies, these trees fall over, and they create an amazing fuel load. And now, you see little tree seedlings coming back up here. Forests do naturally regenerate, but it'll take, for lodgepole pine, 12 years before they produce cones. For other tree species, 20 years. Okay, coming back. See, forest does come back. But if that burns before a seed source is set, you have the reburn phenomenon. There is no seed source out there anymore. And this land now converts to different land use. Weeds, exotics, if they're anywhere in there, knapweed tends to really go ballistic in this stuff, thistles, or fireweed, which is native, and are native species. But this will no longer be forest unless someone artificially plants here. And when we have 5,000 acres that looks like that, and we're in a dry, hot, dry climatic period, we kind of know what's going to happen. And this is where the conservation issue comes in. Is this going to remain forest or is it not? So, and that doesn't mean treat all of it, but treat it in a mosaic like past fires did, or like the Europeans come and or have done. And then we look at a landscape, okay, here's just looking at the pest maps, okay. Now here's a landscape where the beetle outbreak is a mosaic. What does that landscape look like? There it is, okay. Past harvesting units in there. Now, what have we learned in the meantime, of course? Do we need to put a square clear cut on the landscape? Well, if you're a landowner and you're trying to capitalize on value that's there, fine. Flip side is, what we're trying to gain is a social license, because if the general population doesn't like what we're doing, they have the potential of passing a law by a majority stopping us from doing what we're doing. So instead of a square, we could put in a mosaic. Thinning, okay, here's just a thinning example. Mountain pine beetle, no mountain pine beetle. I'm going to go through these real quick. Fire, same thing. So, historically, these clear cuts were bad things because they were big rectangles on the landscape and everybody rallied against that. Now what we're seeing in Colorado and Northern Rockies is these are the only green islands out there. Same thing with fire. In the higher, mid to high elevation, clear cuts, 80% of them do not burn. A couple things. We go back to that successional map. More snowpack, make it to the ground. Less leaf area using that snow, so when the fire burns through here, live fuel moisture is very high. These trees don't want to ignite. Conifers that are drought stressed for long periods of time not only have a low fuel moisture, they produce waxes and terpenes as a drought defense. Waxes and terpenes are like gasoline. They burn more readily. So there's currently some experiments trying to quantify all this stuff. Just wanted to share with you some pictures from Ron Vidsack. He was the fire management officer up in the Kootenai National Forest, burned a lot. And he took these aerial photos of some fires up in the Kootenai. You can see these old clear cuts, rectangular or geometric clear cuts in the lodgepole pine put in the 70s to take out beetle-killed trees. What's remarkable is when we get fires in there, they burn into the old growth and they don't burn into these clear cuts. Now, I put in the caveat, this is mid to high elevation. You get into lower elevation, the ponderosa pine, what you have in those clear cuts is cured grass this tall, and it carries a fire very well. And this is where you can get in these arguments where people say, no, clear cuts burn better. No, clear cuts burn worse. Forests are highly diverse. You have to make sure you say which specific site you're talking about, because it's not apples across the whole thing. There are different rules for different ecological types. Recent research here coming out of the fire lab shows that, just throw these in there, that when you have a fragmented forest where about 1/3 of the forest is in small parcels, fire not only spreads more slowly, it will often extinguish itself. Okay, this is one piece of work here that just came out, Albert Simoni, but it's really showing that the more fragmented the forest is, there's a lot, and see fragmentation, that was a bad word, right? But in a mixed severity fire regime like the Northern Rockies, fragmentation is natural. It's how these forests develop. So if we bring this fragmentation back into these forests, which is, by the way, exactly what the Germans are doing to make their forests more resilient. And this is where the power of German experience came in, because in the Northern Rockies, we're trying to figure out how to conserve these forests. And the conclusion is to bring the mosaic back into it. Different age classes, different species mixture. The question is, what is the patch size? How big of an opening? And we did this without talking to the Germans or looking at what the Germans did. The Germans have come up with exactly the same thing as a way to combat climate change, greater insect disturbance, and the possibility of fire. So we now are starting to see the academic and the research backing for increasing, the value of increasing the diversity and the mosaic out there. Just some other stuff. Here the recommendation is 1/3 of the landscape over 20 years is really all you need to do to have a 50% reduction in rate of fire spread, which means the capacity of fire suppression teams to do their job. Now the trick is, depending where you are, what does that treatment consist of? Because if you thin it too much, you get brush and grass. If you thin it too little, you have a crown fire. So somewhere is that happy medium where you're managing the probability of diminishing crown fire rate of sped and not enhancing surface fire fuels through brush and grasses. And that needs to be worked out on a site-specific level. Okay, I'm just going to skip that. Okay, so this is really a landscape that is analogous with what the Germans have come up with that you find. This is federal land. This is where the Lolo National Forest, the silviculturists, the managers, this was their objective, their target that they reached 20 years ago. Since then, there's been very little done on it, because not for lack of wanting to, it's for lack of social license to do it. So, but it's right up there with what the Europeans are trying to do. So, you know, if two independent bodies come up with the same conclusion, to me that adds some strength to it.